Hello listeners. Mr. Bookman here. Before we get to today's story, subscribe to the channel and click the like button. You can now follow me on Facebook. The link is in the description. I just read that the average person spends 3 hours a day on their cell phones. Now everyone including you can use their cell phones to make $25 or even up to $50 an hour with social media jobs. No experience required to work your own hours from anywhere in the world. Click the link in the description to start making money right now. Now let's dive right into today's book.
Section 9 of The Cruise of the Scandal and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lee Vogler. The Cruise of the Scandal and Other Stories by Victor Bridges. The Strange Adventure of Mr. Bates. Through the uncurtained window, the yellow light of the bar parlor streamed out into the darkness of the November night. Standing in the road, his hand fingering the 2 odd coppers in his trousers pocket, Mr. William Bates gazed irresolutely at the inviting gleam. He was weighing the relative merits of a fire and a glass of beer at the present moment against those of a crude but satisfying breakfast of bread and cheese on the following morning. A clink of glasses, followed by a sudden burst of laughter, seemed to decide the matter, for, casting forethought aside, he advanced up the cobble pathway and pushed open the door of the little country inn. He found himself in a small, low-ceilinged room, lit by a hanging lamp. A wood fire was smouldering away on the open hearth, and round its fragrant glow 2 or 3 men were seated in various attitudes of convivial comfort. They all looked up as he entered. Mr. Bates, being an unobtrusive person by nature, seated himself quietly on an oak settle against the wall. An enormously stout man, who had discarded his coat and was smoking a much-coloured churchwarden, rose slowly from his chair. "Even," he remarked in a genial rumble. "Nasty night, ain't it?" Mr. Bates nodded and shivered. "Come a bit closer to the fire, mate," went on the landlord, for such was evidently the stout gentleman's calling. "You look fair perished." 2 of the men moved back their chairs, and Mr. Bates, accepting the invitation, shifted into a vacant seat at the corner of the hearth. "Glass of beer, please," he said, as the landlord, with an interrogative glance, threw up a small wooden partition that communicated with the bar. The refreshment having arrived, and Mr. Bates having parted with 3 of his 4 last halfpennies, the general conversation interrupted by his entrance was resumed. "Seems to be something funny about it," observed the landlord, looking across at the thin man with gaiters who was sitting on the edge of the table. "Bloomin' funny," emphasized the local postman. "Well, that were his message, anyhow. He says, 'Tell Orneman that I'll be along with my box by 9:30, and I'll be wanting to sleep the night.' He's 'ad a proper row with the old man and chucked his job, that's what he's done." "Got the sack more like," observed the postman, spitting ironically into the fire. "That be as it may. Anyway, I gived the message." "What's the professor going to do?" inquired the landlord. "Ah," said the man with the gaiters, "advertise for someone else, I suppose. He won't have no women about the place, that's certain." "Job's worth having," put in a red-whiskered man who had not previously spoken, "at least judging by the amount of drink Andrew got through." "No one can say as Andrew weren't free with his money," observed the gaitered man. "If it were his money," put in the postman unkindly. There was a sound of steps outside, and the sudden thud of a heavy weight on the ground. "Here he is," said the landlord. The door swung open, and Mr. Bates, looking up, saw a man enter. He was pale-faced, sandy-haired individual, with a sharp nose, watery eyes, and a general air of somewhat dissipated insolence. "Good evening, gentlemen all," he remarked. "Hello, Potter. Give me a message to Orneman?" "That's all right, Mr. Andrew," replied the landlord. "There's a room upstairs if you want one. I'll send George along to get your box in." "What's the meaning of all this 'ere bust-up?" inquired the red-whiskered man, as the newcomer settled himself down with the large glass of Hollands in front of him. Mr. Andrew laughed with a fine assumption of independence. "Just got sick of the old swine and told him so," he replied. "Nearly had a fit when I gave him notice." "Must have been a blow to him," said the postman. "Did you get your last week's wages?" Mr. Andrews looked across coldly. "He offered me a check," he said, "but I told him to keep it and get his 'air cut." "And then you woke up, I suppose," added the postman. "What'll the Professor do without you, Mr. Andrew?" inquired the landlord, anxious to relieve the somewhat strained situation. "Have to look after himself for a day or two, I hope, and I left some work for him. I'll warrant you, there's all yesterday's things unwashed, his rotten old boots dirty, the store's mixed up, and every window and door in the place is unfastened. I only hope," he added viciously, "as some tramp'll come along and clean out the whole place 'fore he finds out. I'd half a mind to chalk up a notice on the gate opposite saying that the kitchen windows at the Firs was unlatched, and that there were plenty of grub and drink for anyone who chose to walk in and help themselves." In the laughter that followed the spirited harangue, Mr. Bates turned to his next-door neighbor, a quiet man who had not spoken yet, and inquired in a subdued voice, "The Firs? Ain't that the house I passed coming along, the little white place standing back on the left?" "That's it, mate," answered the other, "Professor Stinson's. Andrew 'ere was his servant." "Seems to me," observed the gentleman with gaiters, addressing the hero of the evening, "as you've got your own back out of him." Mr. Andrews grinned complacently. "I don't believe in being put on," he admitted. "One man is as good as another, I say, and I like to be treated with proper respect." "And not kicked out of the house like a thief at a minute's notice," added the postman. There was a moment of unpleasant silence. "If you're trying to insinuate—" began Mr. Andrew hotly. "I ain't trying to insinuate nothing," said the postman. "It's my opinion as the Professor's a gentleman, a proper gentleman he is, and he always treated you a sight too well. If I'd have been in his shoes, you'd have been out of it long ago. That's my opinion, Mr. Andrew, and if you don't like it, you can shove it in your pipe and damn well smoke it." So saying, the postman emptied his pot of beer, and, buttoning his uniform, rose defiantly to his feet. Before the heated atmosphere had a chance to burst, however, the landlord again intervened, this time with the full majesty of the law behind him. "1 minute past 10," he cried, snapping a huge watch which he had extracted from the depths of his waistcoat. "I'll be losing my license, standing here listening to your joking. Come along, George, get up the shutters." George, an aged, lopsided gentleman, shuffled out from the bar, and the whole company, with the exception of the indignant and heavily breathing Mr. Andrew, rose reluctantly to their feet. There was a general feeling of disappointment that such a promising situation should have come to such a tame conclusion. Mr. Bates passed through the door with the rest into the darkness outside. Though it was not actually raining, only a shameless optimist could have described it as a fine night. A raw November mist brooded unpleasantly over everything, offering a dismal contrast to the warmth and brightness of the lit bar parlor. Under the circumstances, nobody stayed to gossip on the doorstep, even the thrilling topic of Mr. Andrews' resignation being mutually abandoned. There was a general turning up of coat collars, the flare of a match, a "Good night, Tom," and "Coming my way, Potter?" and all the late revellers clumped away to their respective homes, all of them, that is to say, except Mr. Bates. He, unfortunately, had no home to go to. He stood still, listening to the retreating footsteps. Then, with a faint sigh, he thrust his hands into his pockets and began to walk slowly back along the road in the direction from which he had arrived at the inn. He had covered nearly a quarter of a mile in this fashion when a few yards ahead the dull blue of an oil lamp suddenly appeared through the mist. Mr. Bates stopped and began to peer anxiously through the gloom on his left. "Ought to be just about here," he muttered. If I ain't made a mistake. The shadowy outline of a white gate rewarded his efforts. He climbed carefully over it, and feeling his way by means of a wall that ran right angles to the road, he arrived at a low stone building, which, as far as could be seen in the darkness, bore the appearance of a discarded cowshed. Through an aperture that in more spacious days had probably been the side of a doorway, Mr. Bates passed into his hotel. It was black inside, with that peculiar quality of blackness which seems to affect the breathing power, and there was a faint odor of immemorial cows. Mr. Bates struck a match, and by its spluttering light glanced nervously about him. Against the opposite wall he detected a rough manger, which seemed to be free of some of the less pleasing features of the floor. A year ago, Mr. Bates might have sniffed about its possibilities as a bedstead, but a recent experience had rendered him less critical. Igniting a second match, he made a further inspection, which resulted in the discovery of a couple of indescribably filthy sacks. One of these he rolled up into a pillow and placed in the manger, and then, scrambling in himself and lying down, he drew the other luxuriously over his tired limbs. Some 20 minutes later the sound of deep, steady breathing showed that he was temporarily oblivious to the discomforts of the ill-arranged planet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The last stroke of the village church clock died slowly away, and only the dreary, persistent patter of the rain upon the dead leaves disturbed the uncanny stillness of a sleeping world. Mr. Bates stood irresolutely in the wet darkness, his hands upon the gate which led into the domains of Professor Stinson. At last, very cautiously, he pushed it open and stepped inside. Before him lay the drive, lined with laurels and overhung by several gaunt, leafless elms. It was even blacker than the roadway. Step by step, he felt his way along, till all of a sudden the shrubbery came to an end, and he found himself at the edge of a small gravelled space, facing the front door. At the side of the house he could just discern a path, which appeared to run around to the back. Crouching down and moving his feet as noiselessly as possible, he advanced along it, keeping one hand on the ivy-clad wall to guide his steps. After about 12 yards of this uncomfortable progress, he came round the corner into a small square yard. There was a back door with 2 windows on either side of it, while above these again were apparently 3 rooms. All were in complete darkness. With his heart in his mouth, Mr. Bates crept up to the first window and peered through. He could see nothing. It was like staring into a sheet of black paper. For a second he hesitated, and then, placing his hand against the sash of the bottom pane, gave it a tentative push. It yielded instantly to his pressure, sliding up a matter of 2 or 3 inches with a wheezy rattle that made him start back in fresh access of alarm. Surely someone must have heard it. He half turned to run, and then paused irresolutely, his ears strained for the first sound of any movement within the house. Nothing happened, however, and after waiting several minutes, Mr. Bates regained his courage. Very gingerly he again raised the sash, and with extreme caution inserted his head through the empty window frame. It was the kitchen. Of that there could be no doubt. An unpleasing odor of boiled cabbage and damp clothes and dirty plates, attesting to the professional deficiencies of the owner's late servant. Raising himself upon his hands, Mr. Bates lifted his leg and scrambled in noiselessly over the sill. Then he felt in his pocket for a match. By the aid of a dry portion of his trousers, he struck it without any superfluous noise, and shading it with his hand, glanced nervously about him. It was evident that Mr. Andrews' vaunt had not been an entirely idle one. The room was in a state of shocking disorder. Heaped up anyhow on the table were the dirty appliances of at least 3 meals. A mountainous pile of ashes beneath the grate bore eloquent testimony to daily tasks neglected, and at least 3 pairs of unclean boots scattered about the floor did nothing to remove the impression. Mr. Bates looked around with a disapproving and disgusted eye. A tidy man by nature and training, his fingers itched to set about this confusion. The flame of the match reaching his thumb, however, reminded him sharply that he was there upon other and more pressing business. Dropping the charred stump with a mild and whispered oath, he ignited a second, and by its light perceived, on the further side of the apartment, an open door leading into a larder. On a shelf against the wall he could just detect the outline of cold chicken, apparently still intact. Mr. Bates did not wait for an invitation. In a moment he had crossed the floor and entered the attractive storehouse. Seizing the chicken, he held up the match and gazed around for further contributions. Half a loaf of bread was the first object to meet his eye, and this, together with a small piece of German sausage, which he found on a plate behind it, satisfied his requirements. Thrusting his booty under his arm and throwing down his second match, which by this time had burned itself away, he stepped out into the darkness of the kitchen. As he did so, a slight sound made him pause. An instant later there was a sharp click, and then a blinding flare of electric light suddenly flooded the room. Mr. Bates staggered back against a wall, his plunder and his jaw dropping at the same moment. An elderly gentleman in a Jagger dressing gown, with a revolver in his hand, was leaning comfortably against the kitchen door. He was clean-shaven, with longish white hair. A pleasant, if somewhat ironical, smile lurked about his face. "Flagrante delicto, Mr. Burglar," he remarked, "or to use a language with which you are possibly better acquainted, caught in the act, eh?" Mr. Bates licked his lips, which felt very dry. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "You will oblige me by keeping your hands above your head? Thank you. Now permit me to introduce myself. My name is Professor Stenson." "Yes, sir," repeated Mr. Bates hoarsely. "And yours, my friend?" "William Bates, sir." "And if you won't think me inquisitive, Mr. Bates, may I ask what you are doing in my house at this time of the morning?" Mr. Bates wriggled, his eyes glued on the muzzle of the revolver. "The fact is, sir," he jerked out, "I was hungry, sir." "Ah," said the professor, "and I suppose you mistook the Firs for a hotel. That is the worst of modern architecture. It has no distinctive note." With this statement Mr. Bates apparently agreed. After all events, he offered no comment on it. When he spoke again, which he did after a brief pause, his topic was of an altogether different nature. "If you please, sir," he stammered nervously, would you mind not pointing that thing at me, sir? It might go off." "I have no particular wish to point it at you," replied the professor. "The posture is both fatiguing and ridiculous. If you will take your coat off and place it on the floor, so that I can see you are not armed, I shall be delighted to assume a less martial attitude. Be good enough to keep your hands from your pockets while you are doing it, or I shall shoot you without hesitation." With shaking fingers Mr. Bates proceeded to disrobe, being very careful to hold his tattered garment by the extreme edge. Having shed it, he stood in his shirt sleeves, looking about as dishevelled and miserable as a housebreaker as ever cracked a crib. His captor gazed at him thoughtfully for a moment, and then lowered his weapon. Mr. Bates breathed an audible sigh of relief. "And now we are at our ease," said the professor, "I should be interested to hear a little more about you. If you won't think me insulting, your methods, from the technical point of view, appear to be deplorably amateurish. Why didn't you lock the kitchen door?" There was something in the professor's tone which made Mr. Bates feel a shade less like a trapped rat. He even drew himself up with a pathetic effort at courage. "I assure you, sir," he said earnestly, "I am no burglar." The professor looked at him quizzically. "I'm inclined to agree with you, Mr. Bates," he said. "It was very wrong of me to come in here, sir, I admit, But I was hungry, sir, desperately hungry, and I knew that I should find some food inside. I assure you, sir, I had no intention of taking away anything else. And may I inquire why you were so certain about the contents of my kitchen? Indeed, how did you even know it was the kitchen? If you please, sir, it was hearing what Mr. Andrews said at the inn last night. A sudden look of illumination flashed across the professor's face. "Oh," he said, "so that is how the land lies, is it? I am indebted to the gentle Andrew for the pleasure of your acquaintance, eh? Well, come, don't be reticent, my friend. Let us have the whole story." Bit by bit, with his eyes still on the revolver, Mr. Bates proceeded to relate the incidents of the previous night, from the time of his entry into the inn. The professor listened to him without interrupting, the same curious, half ironical, half good-natured smile playing all the time about his mouth. Once, when he heard of the postman's final remark, he laughed out loud. "So Mercury is evidently a gentleman of penetration," he observed. "What did you think of Andrew yourself, Mr. Bates?" I didn't like him at all, sir. He seemed to me shifty, incompetent fellow, and insolent, sir, very insolent." "I dare say you are right," said the professor. "He was only insolent to me once, but that may have been for lack of second opportunity. Shifty he certainly was. As for incompetence, well, look at the state of this kitchen, Mr. Bates." Mr. Bates looked. "Yes, sir," he said warmly, "it's disgraceful. It was the first thing I noticed when I came in when I was—" He stopped abruptly. Well, when you were what? Let's have it, my friend." "I was going to say, sir, when I was in the service, I should have died of shame if anyone had seen my kitchen in such a state." The professor raised his eyebrows. "When you were in service, eh? So you've risen in the world, Mr. Bates. How long is it since you have exchanged the livery for the crape and jack boots?" "I beg your pardon, sir?" "When was your last professional engagement?" "I've been out of place, sir, since I left Mr. Houghton 18 months ago." "And what were you doing for Mr. Houghton?" "Everything, sir. He was a bachelor gentleman. He didn't care to have women servants about the house, so I looked after him entirely." "Dear me, how extremely fortunate!" exclaimed the professor. "Your visit is what the vicar would call almost providential, Mr. Bates. Before I discharge my duty as a citizen by handing you over to the local policeman, you will be able to straighten out all this distressing confusion for me. If you do it efficiently, it will doubtlessly be taken into consideration by the magistrate." "Yes, sir," murmured Mr. Bates dejectedly. "Well, suppose we start upon the boots, then. It would be pleasant to have a pair of boots properly cleaned again. You will find the brushes and some blacking in the cupboard." Mr. Bates opened the door and took out the articles in question. He then collected the 3 pairs of boots which were scattered about the floor, and silently set to work. The professor, sitting on a corner of the kitchen table, with the revolver dangling in his hand, watched him with amused interest. When the last boot was finished and laid aside, he got up. "The work reflects great credit on you, Mr. Bates," he remarked approvingly. "I shall be proud to wear them. Do you think you're equally skillful at washing up plates and dishes?" "I think so, sir," said Mr. Bates meekly. "Well, we may as well make certain, eh? Suppose you collect some of these and bring them into the scullery." He pushed open a third door and turned on a switch. "There's a gas stove in here, so we can have plenty of hot water in a few minutes." Scraping up the various remnants from the plates and dishes, Mr. Bates heaped the latter up in 2 piles and carried them into the scullery. The professor meanwhile had filled a large washing pan up with water and placed it on the stove. "While we are waiting for it to boil," he said, "you might tell me a little more about your past history. In view of your accomplishments, how did Mr. Houghton ever bring himself to part with you?" "Please, sir, he died." "A pity," said the professor, "but surely you should have found a little difficulty in obtaining another place?" Mr. Bates hung his head. The professor looked at him. "Ah," he said after a short pause, "I thought there must be some reason. Come, Mr. Bates, what's the trouble? Never be afraid to speak the truth." "I was out of a place for about 3 months, sir, and my wife got very ill, sir, and I had spent all my savings. The doctor said the only chance of saving her was to send her out of London. I went to call on a gentleman about a place, and while I was waiting, sir, I saw a couple of sovereigns on the mantelpiece, and I took them, sir." "That was very wrong of you, Mr. Bates," said the professor. "Yes, sir." "What happened?" "The money was missed, and I was arrested, sir. The magistrate was very good to me. He might have sent me to prison, but he only bound me over. I'm very grateful to him. Still, that finished me as far as work was concerned, sir." "And your wife?" Mr. Bates suddenly began to cry. "My wife is dead, sir." "Dear me," said the professor, turning his head away. "Dear me." There was a short pause, during which Mr. Bates began mechanically to wash up. The professor sat in silence while plate after plate was cleaned and put aside. When both piles were finished, he looked up at the small clock which was ticking away on the mantelpiece. The time was about 5:27 to 7. "It's a little early for breakfast," he remarked, "but I think as you are here, Mr. Bates, I will take advantage of the fact by getting you to cook me some eggs and bacon. There ought to be plenty, unless Andrew has excelled himself." "Yes, sir," said Mr. Bates. The professor went out into the larder, returning almost immediately with the required provisions. "If you will cook these," he said, "I will go on with laying the table." "Oh, don't you trouble, sir. I can do it," protested Mr. Bates. "Please do what you are asked, Mr. Bates, and you might make some tea at the same time. The canister is on the shelf above you." "Yes, sir." "And bring it all to the kitchen as soon as it is ready." "Yes, sir." The fragrant smell of the hissing eggs and bacon was the most exquisite torture to Mr. Bates. An agonizing longing to seize some of the food and stuff it into his mouth almost dazed him with intensity. Nevertheless, he firmly proceeded with his task, turning out a succulent steaming dish, just cooked to precisely the right point. Then he made tea, and taking down a plate which he had put to warm, placed the whole lot upon a tray, and carried it into the kitchen. The professor was sitting at the table, which was laid for two. "Excellent," he said, taking off the cover and looking at the contents. "But how is this? You have only brought one plate?" "I thought that was all you would require, sir." "But there is yourself, Mr. Bates. I laid a place for you under the impression that you were hungry." "Oh, sir," said Mr. Bates with a little gasp, "if I may have something outside, sir, I should hardly like to sit down with you, sir." The professor raised his eyebrows again. "Really, Mr. Bates, a little more self-respect, if you please. You must remember that you are a burglar now, not a valet." "Yes, sir." Mr. Bates seated himself in the second chair, and the professor, whose appetite seemed suddenly to have vanished, helped him to about 7/8 of the eggs and bacon. Mr. Bates fell upon them with as much ferocity as his professional refinement would permit. The professor handed him a cup of tea, and after watching him for a minute, got up and walked to where a phone was fastened to the wall. He took off the receiver. "Are you there?" he said. "Please put me on to the London Exchange." "Yes, thank you." "Don't you bother, Mr. Bates. Go on with breakfast." "Is that the Exchange?" "I want 400 City." "Yes." "Help yourself to some more tea while you wait, Mr. Bates." "Are you there? Is that the Scotland Yard?" "Professor Stenson. Would you ask Inspector Green to come to the telephone?" "All right." "You'll find some marmalade in the white pot, Mr. Bates." "Is that you, Green?" "Yes. I want you to do something for me. It's just to look up the record of a man named William Bates, who was bound over at, where was it, Mr. Bates? Marylebone, on what date? May 7th. I should like to have any information you possess." He turned and contemplated Mr. Bates, who was staring at him with his mouth open. "Wonderful invention the telephone, isn't it, Mr. Bates?" he remarked. "It keeps us so in touch with the actual facts of existence. But don't let my private business interfere with your breakfast. You must be hungry after your somewhat uncomfortable night." Mr. Bates said nothing. He seemed content to stare and eat. Another minute or two elapsed. "Yes, I'm here," said the professor, suddenly, turning again to the instrument. "Thanks." A pause. What's that? Another and longer pause. Oh, thanks very much. Yes, that's all. I shall probably see you Wednesday. I hope to look in about that Stevenson case. Yes. Goodbye. He hung up the receiver. Well, Mr. Bates, he said, approaching the table, it appears that you have spoken the truth. Mr. Bates gulped down his last mouthful. Yes, sir, he said. The professor eyed him for a moment severely. It is, of course, my duty, he said, to hand you over to the law. Yes, sir. But, being opposed to carrying duty to too logical an extreme, I'm prepared to make you an alternative offer. If you would care to take the place of the professionally defunct Mr. Andrew, I am willing to give you a trial. Your work would be to devote the same care and skill to my comfort that you doubtless bestowed on the late Mr. Houghton. Your wages will be £50 a year, and I shall give you a fortnight's holiday. For a naturally reserved and properly trained servant, Mr. Bates' response was unpardonable. Rising to his feet, he staggered around the table, and falling on his knees in front of the professor, he began feebly groping for the latter's hand. He was sobbing so loudly that it was difficult to hear what he said. It sounded like, oh, thank you, sir. God bless you, sir. For the third time the professor raised his eyebrows. Really, Bates, he said, a little more self-control, if you please. You must remember that you're a valet now, not a burglar. End of section 9.
Well, listeners, it looks like we have come to the end of the story. On your way out, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click on the link in the description if you want to start making money right now with social media jobs. Just know you are appreciated. Mr. Bookman is now signing off.